Well, you're all very welcome here this evening to this on Cumann Staire, the Historical Studies Society of the National University of Ireland Galway's fourth lecture in their series of lectures under the general theme of Irish political crises in the post-independence period or in independent Ireland. And the subject of tonight's lecture, of course, is Charles Haughey's GUBU government of 1982. An administration that was beset by a significant number of scandals and intrigues and sometimes self-imposed crises, and not a little bit of bad luck as well, if I'm being honest. Now, before I begin, there's just one point of note I want to make. For those of you who may have joined us for our previous lectures on subjects like the Army Mutiny of 1924 and the Mother and Child Crisis of 1951, and indeed at our last lecture, the Arms Crisis of 1970. You may note that there is a slight difference in format or in the structure of tonight's lecture as opposed to those other ones. Because with all the other governments that we discussed in those respective lectures, there was generally a singular crisis that government had to face or overcome. But in relation to the subject of tonight's lecture, there isn't just one singular crisis. In actual fact, there was almost a cacophony of crises, some of them minor, others more major, but all of which arguably had an aggregate effect on the position of this particular government and contributed at least in part to its ultimate demise. Now, I suppose in order to get a full understanding of at the very least, the history behind the internal political difficulties which this government endured, we have to go back a little bit further in time to a period before the government was formed. When the then Taoiseach Jack Lynch signalled his intention to resign as Taoiseach or Prime Minister and leader of Fianna Fáil in 1979, some of the discord which had been festering within the Fianna Fáil party since at least the mid-1960s erupted back out into the open again. There were two main factions vying for the leadership position of Fianna Fáil in December 1979. One was led by George Colley, who you see here, and he was regarded as the favourite because the clear majority of the leadership figures within Fianna Fáil supported George Colley, who was then the Minister for Finance. He was also Jack Lynch's, the outgoing Taoiseach's, preferred candidate. So it came as quite a surprise to the leadership, or most of the leadership at any rate, of Fianna Fáil at this time, when the actual successor, or when the winning candidate in this internal election within Fianna Fáil was actually Charles Haughey. Haughey defeated Colley largely as a consequence of his assiduous consolidation of support within the backbench element of the Fianna Fáil party. And despite the fact that Haughey was now the leader of Fianna Fáil and Taoiseach, Prime Minister, from December 1979, his position was not as secure as one might think, because that other wing of the party, the Colley wing, the old leadership wing, did not trust Charles Haughey and did not like Charles Haughey, and were ultimately waiting for the opportunity to oust Charles Haughey as leader of Fianna Fáil. Now, of those who did support Charles Haughey at this time, there were arguably three reasons, or there were three types of backbencher that supported Mr. Haughey. One group arguably supported him simply for personal reasons, that they hoped that by supporting Haughey, there was a chance that he would offer political preferment for them in the future, that they might get promotion within the party or indeed within government. The second group, which likely supported Haughey, did so on the basis that they regarded him as being more irredentist, more nationalistic, more Republican, if you will, than the previous Taoiseach, Jack Lynch, or than the other candidate, George Colley. And remember, for those of you who joined us at the previous lecture, Mr. Haughey, of course, had been one of the key figures in the alleged attempt to illegally import weapons into this state to supply them to nationalist elements in Northern Ireland back in 1970. So there was a view among some that he harboured very strong Republican, if you will, tendencies, and they voted for him on that basis. And then the third group which voted for Mr. Haughey within the Fianna Fáil parliamentary party at this time were people who genuinely believed that he was the kind of strong character, the strong man who would be able to take charge of the Irish economy and institute the necessary cuts and retrenchment in public spending that was required at that time. It would not be a subjective comment to make that the Fianna Fáil government of Jack Lynch between 1977 and 1979, well, their handling of the Irish economy was rather poor. Now granted, there were external factors as well. There was a serious oil crisis in the late 1970s. But nevertheless, much of our difficulties in the Irish economy in 1979 and in the early 80s were self-imposed. So there were those within the party who felt that Haughey was the strong man who could reorientate the Irish economy back to buoyancy. However, those who supported him, at least in terms of his alleged financial acumen, were to be significantly disappointed. By the time that Haughey called a general election as Taoiseach in June 1981, it was clear that the Irish economy had not improved under his tenure. In fact, it had actually gone further into the doldrums. Public spending had increased, with the result that in that particular election, Fianna Fáil lost power. And a new Fine Gael Labour, albeit minority Fine Gael Labour coalition, took power in Parliament in June in 1981 under the leadership of the then Taoiseach and leader of Fine Gael, Dr. Garret FitzGerald. However, those who now hoped, as in Haughey's opponents within Fianna Fáil, who now hoped that this would be an opportunity to oust him, were themselves to be somewhat disappointed because they didn't get the opportunity, or at least they weren't, I suppose, speedy enough in attempting to oust him at this point, because by some fortune, at least for Mr. Haughey, this government, Dr. FitzGerald's government, fell quite quickly. It fell in February 1982, less than a year after taking power. And it fell as a consequence of the now infamous children's shoes budget of 1982, in which the then Minister for Finance, John Bruton, Fine Gael TD, he signalled his intention to impose what had then been an exemption, but to impose value-added tax or VAT on children's clothing and shoes. And he also signalled his intention to institute swinging public spending cuts, swinging cuts in public spending also. So as a consequence of this, one of the two TDs, independent TDs, that this government had been relying on for votes to keep them in power, refused to vote in favour of this particular budget, and the government fell. So this provided Haughey then with a second opportunity to try and get an overall majority as leader of Fianna Fáil in the February election of 1982. But whilst Fianna Fáil did increase its seat number in February 1982. He increased it by 3 to 81. He nevertheless was 3 seats shy of an overall majority once again in Parliament. That being said, however, Fianna Fáil was the single largest entity within Parliament at that time. That's including a combination of Fine Gael and Labour, with the result that he looked set to have at least the best opportunity to form a new minority administration once he could, if Mr. Haughey was in a position to try and convince some of the other smaller parties in the Dáil, such as the Independents or Sinn Féin Workers' Party, as it was known at the time, to possibly support him and help elect him as Taoiseach. However, even before Mr. Haughey had the opportunity to try and court some of these other independent TDs, he was to be beset by a certain amount of embarrassment. Just a few days, or actually I think 2 days or so after that February election in 1981, his longtime friend, his solicitor, and his election agent, a man called Pat O'Connor, he and his wife were both arrested and charged with electoral fraud, essentially. They were charged with breaching the abuses of the Electoral Act, Prevention of Electoral Abuses Act of 1923, for allegedly having attempted to vote, or having actually voted twice in that election, that both of them had voted in 2 different polling places or 2 different election centres. Now, and this obviously, once this hit the media, just a few days after the election, this became was a significant point of embarrassment for Mr. Haughey and for Fianna Fáil more generally. Now, the case against the O'Connors was ultimately dismissed, because the judge in the case interpreted the law accurately, in fairness. It's a technicality, but nevertheless it's an accurate one, that there was no way that the prosecution could actually prove that either of the O'Connors had voted more than once. And in actual fact, it wasn't even possible to prove they had voted once at all, because in order to prove that they had voted at all, the prosecution would need to produce the ballot paper on which they had inscribed their preferences. But of course, once a ballot paper goes into the ballot box, it's absolutely impossible to be sure who inscribed their preference on it. So there was no way of actually proving, not only was there no way of proving that the O'Connors had voted twice each, there was no way of even proving they had voted once, and consequently the case was dismissed. On a technicality, yes, but dismissed nonetheless. But nevertheless, obviously, most people drew their own conclusions about what had happened, and it was somewhat embarrassing for Mr. Haughey and for Fianna Fáil. And some of the more humorous political commentators at the time used, when they were referring to this story, used to refer to Mr. O'Connor as Pat O'Connor, Pat O'Connor, a kind of a reference to the fact that his name appeared twice on the electoral register. And now, still at this same period of time, before he even had the opportunity to again try and fully court, as one might say, the other independent TDs, there was a leadership challenge finally instigated against Mr. Haughey from within Fianna Fáil. Those who had been vehemently opposed to him, as I say, from the beginning, from December 1979, mounted a challenge. And their principal contender, or the principal leader of the challenge, was a man called Desmond O'Malley, a TD from Limerick, former Minister for Justice, and, as I say, a vehement opponent of Mr. Haughey throughout his career, or at least since the arms crisis period of 1970 at any rate. But I think it's fair to say that the organisation of this coup against Mr. Haughey was rather amateurish. The other members, the other leading figures, people like George Colley, who I mentioned earlier, and another man, Martin O'Donoghue, they proved rather inept in their attempts to try and garner sufficient support from within the parliamentary party to oust Mr. Haughey before the new parliament met on the 9th of March. Because this was the idea, that they would have a Fianna Fáil parliamentary party meeting, and at which they would have a leadership battle, and then whoever won that leadership battle, be it Mr. O'Malley or Mr. Haughey, would be the party's nominee for Taoiseach when the new parliament met on the 9th of March. But as I say, they were rather amateurish. That being said, the Irish media didn't help them, because just a few days before the parliamentary party meeting, the Irish Independent newspaper published the names of 47 Fianna Fáil TDs who they suspected were likely to vote for Mr. O'Malley. So this now presented the Haughey wing of the party with a ready-made list of people that they could work on, that they could isolate and potentially lean on, if you will, in order to get them to sway their vote back towards the boss. And speaking about these events many years later, it was in 2005, a very strong supporter of Mr. Haughey at this time, a man called Pádraig Flynn, who would later be Mr. Haughey's Minister for Gaeltacht in the GUBU government. He stated in this interview, Bruce Arnold had been writing that Des O'Malley was going to win, and he had foretold that, or predicted that, he would get 47 votes in the parliamentary party, and named them in the paper. Well, now you don't name people like that in the paper to somebody like me, and to friends of mine. Really, those 47? Suddenly we had a little call to those of that 47 that needed to be called, and they were going to vote for Charlie Haughey. Now, I think it's fair to say that despite my best efforts to convey the tone of Mr. Flynn's voice and general demeanour in that interview, I probably don't really do justice. And I think that if you were to watch the interview yourself, it was in a documentary that was made on Mr. Haughey's life. Again, as I say, aired on RT in 2005, I think. And it really, if you were to watch Mr. Flynn in that interview, you get a real flavour, I think. I mean, it's a subjective opinion, but you would get something of a flavour of the potential air of perhaps even menace that there might have been in terms of some of those little calls that were made to some of those wavering 47 TDs. At any rate, the calls worked. Mr. Haughey was to survive the vote of the parliamentary party on, I think it was 6th of March, I think, and he was therefore going to be the nominee for Taoiseach by Fianna Fáil. However, he still had to garner extra votes within Parliament itself in order to guarantee that he would have a majority on the 9th of March to be elected Taoiseach. So he turned towards some of the independents. The first independent which guaranteed Mr. Haughey's vote was Neil Blaney. Now, some of you who were with us before might recall he was another central figure during the arms crisis issue of 1970. He was a former member of Fianna Fáil, but at this point in time he was an independent, although technically or officially he called himself independent Fianna Fáil. Because he believed he was more Fianna Fáil than the rest of the party, essentially. And on the basis of some verbal promises on the part of Mr. Haughey that he would adopt a strong, robust, irredentist, quite nationalist approach to Northern Irish affairs and to Anglo-Irish relations, because Mr. Blaney was a strong irredentist nationalist himself, on the basis that Mr. Haughey would also adopt a similar type approach while in government, Blaney guaranteed his vote. So that was one extra vote. The second independent that Mr. Haughey turned to was a man called Tony Gregory. At this point in time, Tony Gregory was a new TD to Parliament. It was his first time to be elected to the Irish Parliament. And he was a strong left-wing socialist, if you will, TD from the city of Dublin. He had originally been involved in what was then official Sinn Féin and what later became Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, in the mid-1970s. But now he was an independent. And normally he would not be likely to vote for someone like Mr. Haughey or to support Fianna Fáil, which he would probably have regarded as a right-wing capitalist party. But on the basis of negotiations and discussions between Mr. Haughey and Mr. Gregory, Tony Gregory extracted from Mr. Haughey a number of promises, what became known as the Gregory deal, in which once in exchange for his vote in Parliament, the subsequent Fianna Fáil administration would make investments roughly to the tune of about 80 million Irish pounds at that time, a very significant amount of money at that time, into the Dublin inner city area and into some other projects that Mr. Gregory was advocating. And indeed, when Tony Gregory read the specifics, or some of the specifics of this deal into the parliamentary record on the 9th of March, when the Dáil met, when the Parliament met, there was consternation amongst the opposition benches particularly amongst Fine Gael, who felt that this was a disproportionate amount of money that was being invested in just one area. Although the area needed the money, there's no doubt about that. But given the financial difficulties the Irish state was in, they regarded it as unconscionable to be investing such a disproportionate amount of money in just one area. And there was probably some consternation among some elements of Fianna Fáil as well. Nevertheless, Mr. Haughey now had Gregory's vote. And just to further guarantee that he would be Taoiseach on the 9th of March, he also turned to that other party, Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party. Now, I should clarify for a moment, just in case there might be any confusion, this Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, is not the same as Provisional Sinn Féin, which is the organisation most of you would know that was run by Gerry Adams until relatively recently and is now run by Mary Lou MacDonald as the president of. So Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, was a different organisation. And it subsequently renamed itself as simply the Workers' Party, actually during 1982, I think. And ironically, although they came from what was known as the official Republican movement at the time, and had some links, many people still believed, with the official IRA, official Sinn Féin, or Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, had a much more evolving view by the late 1970s on the issue of Northern Ireland. And it's arguable that they took a more unionist-friendly perspective, ironically, in relation to Northern Ireland, one that was probably much more conciliatory than even Fianna Fáil's position was, and certainly was one that was much at variance with Neil Blaney's position. So this resulted in, Charles Haughey turned to the Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, and on the basis again of some kind of verbal promises that Haughey would take a relatively tame line in relation to Northern Ireland, kind of the opposite to what he had promised verbally to Neil Blaney, and also on the basis that he would roll back on some of the more stringent public spending cuts that the coalition had introduced. It was agreed that Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, would vote for Haughey on the 9th of March to be Taoiseach. So he's elected Taoiseach again on the 9th of March, despite the odds. And but as you can see, or as has been demonstrated, the fact that he was relying on people like Neil Blaney, Tony Gregory, and Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, to keep him in power in the event of a major vote in Parliament. These were people with very disparate ideologies and disparate perspectives. So he was, from the very beginning, there was an inherent form of instability, numerically speaking, within this government, or within this Parliament indeed. And so Haughey immediately set about trying to rebalance things a little bit and to get himself at least one extra vote in Parliament. And to do this, he had something of a cunning plan, which was that the position of the Irish Commissioner in the EEC, the European Economic Community at that time, was vacant. And it was vacant because the previous commissioner, who was a Fianna Fáil politician, a guy called Michael O'Kennedy, he had returned to Ireland in 1982 to fight the election and to get elected to this Parliament. And he won in the election. He was elected to the Parliament. So he had to resign his seat as a commissioner in Europe. So now the position was vacant, and it was the government's job to appoint a new commissioner. Now, under normal circumstances, usually the governing party would appoint one of their own politicians, or someone that they liked, essentially. It was seen as a plum job and a very prestigious position. But on this occasion, Haughey opted to offer the position of the Irish Commissioner to a guy called Richard, or something usually known as Dick Burke. Now, he had the credentials for the job. He had previously been an Irish Commissioner in Europe himself, but he was a member of Fine Gael, and he was a TD, a sitting member of the Irish Parliament. He was a member of the opposition. But Haughey's view was that if Richard Burke took the position in Europe, he would have to resign his seat in Parliament. So this immediately would give Fianna Fáil a 1-seat extra advantage over the Fine Gael opposition. And also Haughey hoped that once there was a by-election to fill that seat, Fianna Fáil might win. So half of his cunning plan worked out. Richard Burke did take the job in Europe, and the seat became vacant in Parliament for a while, and then there was a by-election. But Fianna Fáil lost the by-election. Fine Gael kept the seat, even though their candidate was a relatively unknown man at the time, but still Fine Gael won the seat back again. So this increased the disenchantment somewhat within Fianna Fáil party towards Charlie Haughey's leadership, because not only had he failed to win the by-election, but he had given this plum job, this prestigious job, to a blue shirt, to a member of the opposition of Fine Gael. So this, unfortunately, this didn't do a whole lot of favours for Mr. Haughey. And of course, now we move on to the travails and the difficulties of Mr. Haughey's appointee as Minister for Justice, Seán Doherty. Seán Doherty was a TD from County Roscommon. He had been previously a member of the Irish police force on Garda Síochána himself, but during the 1970s he left the Gardaí and became a Fianna Fáil politician. And he was a strong supporter of Charles Haughey and supported his bid for the leadership in 1979. With the result that Haughey appointed him as Minister for Justice in March 1982. However, the anti-Haughey element of the party, in particular, disliked Seán Doherty. They regarded him as being, in what could be, in the modern parlance as we know of, being all spin and no substance. They were of the view that he wasn't a particularly hard worker within the Department of Justice, and that he was more eager to self-publicise. Now, the truth of that is a matter of debate, but this is the perception that those who did not like Haughey and did not like Seán Doherty had of him. And unfortunately, this perception wasn't aided by rumours and allegations that began to emerge throughout the tenure of this government between March and December 1982 with respect to some of Seán Doherty's alleged activities. It was alleged that he had been that he would be putting pressure on occasion on certain Gardaí, particularly in his own constituency of County Roscommon, to drop charges against certain constituents who might be supporters of Mr. Doherty himself. It was also alleged that he may have been involved in forced transfers of certain Gardaí out of certain stations and to other areas. And one of the most egregious allegations that emerged in the media in relation to Mr. Doherty was what was known as the so-called Dowra Affair. This related to another Garda who was a serving Garda, a man called Thomas Nagel. And in December 1981, Mr. Nagel had been Garda Nagel, but he was off duty, had been socialising in a bar or in a public house in Dowra in County Cavan, at which point, and during the night, he was alleged to have assaulted another customer, a man called James McGovern, who was actually a citizen from Northern Ireland. And when the court case subsequently came up in County Cavan in, I think it was September 1982, so during the period now of the GUBU government itself, when the court case subsequently was held in Cavan in September, I think, 1982, the case against Mr. Nagel was dismissed. And it was dismissed because the prosecution were unable to provide the main witness and the victim of the assault, James McGovern, in court. So the case was dismissed. Now, the reason why Mr. McGovern did not present himself in court is because that morning, before the hearing, he had been arrested by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, the police force in Northern Ireland, where he lived. And he was interrogated for a number of hours, but by all accounts, very benignly. There was nothing majorly unfortunate or aggressive about the interrogation. But nevertheless, he was held for a number of hours before being released. Too late, however, of course, to present himself for the court case of Nagel in County Cavan. Now, when the facts, and then of course the key fact which I left till the end was that Garda Nagel, the defendant in the case, was the brother-in-law of Seán Doherty, the Irish Minister for Justice. So when all these facts, which I've just laid out, and they're the facts, when those facts emerged in the media in, I think, early October 1982, it caused consternation, because immediately certain commentators began to connect the dots, as it were. And some came to the conclusion that Mr. McGovern, who had had no known history of subversive or any form of illegal or paramilitary or terrorist activity, had been picked up and interrogated and subsequently released without charge by the Royal Ulster Constabulary on the very day he was supposed to give evidence against the brother-in-law of the Irish Minister for Justice. They came to the conclusion that there must have been collusion between elements within the Gardaí and elements within the police force in another jurisdiction to intentionally detain Mr. McGovern in order to pervert the course of justice in our state here. And thus, ultimately, that perhaps the Minister for Justice was behind it all himself. Now again, there was no way of proving any of this, but these were the dots that were being joined together by many commentators and indeed by many members of the political opposition, and also by certain elements within Fianna Fáil itself, who were already disenchanted with Mr. Doherty's behaviour during this time. However, all of these issues paled in comparison to what became known as the phone tapping scandal. So this related to concerns that Haughey, Charles Haughey, was having in relation to what he regarded as leaks from the cabinet table during the entire tenure of this government from March to December in 1982. It was clear that a number of journalists, in particular Bruce Arnold and Geraldine Kennedy, who you see here, these political journalists were obviously receiving inside information in relation to the disgruntlement and the opposition that there was to Charles Haughey's leadership within the Fianna Fáil party. They were not receiving information of a national security nature. They were not receiving information that could be regarded as really breaching official secrets acts or anything like that. They were receiving information about the internal political difficulties within Fianna Fáil. But Haughey took this very much to heart, and he effectively instructed Seán Doherty and the other man you see here, the Assistant Commissioner at the time, Joe Ainsworth, who was, in real terms, he was the man in charge of the counter-terrorist section of the Irish police force of An Garda Síochána at that time. He instructed them to find out who was speaking, who from Fianna Fáil, who from his own government possibly, was speaking to Geraldine Kennedy, or people like Geraldine Kennedy and people like Bruce Arnold, and giving away his secrets about the difficulties, the internal tensions within the Fianna Fáil party. So I won't go into the specific details because there's many of them and it's quite laborious, but suffice it to say that ultimately Seán Doherty, the Minister for Justice, instigated phone tappings of these two journalists by suborning essentially, or instructing Ainsworth and ultimately, through Ainsworth, the Commissioner of the Police himself, Patrick McLaughlin, to tap the phones of Bruce Arnold and Geraldine Kennedy. Now it didn't happen at the exact same time, but it happened during the period of this government. So this was clearly, demonstrably an abuse of political power. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Importantly, however, though, this particular scandal, as we could regard it, this actually didn't contribute in real terms to the fall of the GUBU government, because the facts of this and of this particular scandal didn't actually emerge until January 1983, after this government left power and after the new Fine Gael Labour government came into power and publicised these details. But it speaks, however, to the degree of paranoia, the degree of disgruntlement, the degree of discord within the Fianna Fáil party throughout the period of this particular government from March until December 1982. However, this scandal also pales in significance when we compare it to what became known as, or what could be dubbed as, the MacArthur Affair. This related to a man called, who you see here, Malcolm MacArthur. At this period in time, he was roughly in his mid-30s. He was an Irish citizen. He was an Irish citizen, but he had been living abroad for some time. He had a common law partner and one child, I believe. But he had been living for a number of years off a substantial inheritance which he had gotten from his parents' estate after they passed. But by mid-1982, the money was running out. And Mr. MacArthur decided ultimately to return to Ireland in order to embark on a life of crime. This was his actual objective. And his intention, it would appear, was to become an armed robber, essentially to acquire a weapon and to commit armed robberies in order to bolster his finances. So again, there are many details to this case, which there are too many to go into here. But ultimately, his career as an armed robber was absolutely unsuccessful. I don't believe he ever gained anything from his attempted robberies. I think there was only one major attempted robbery anyway, for cash, that is. But unfortunately, his very short career as a criminal resulted in the murder of two tragically innocent and completely unconnected to him people. A young nurse called Bridie Gargan, who he assaulted and effectively mortally wounded in the Phoenix Park as he tried to steal her car, and another individual, a man called Donald Dunn, whose weapon MacArthur stole. Well, he murdered Mr. Dunn before he took his weapon, of course. He singularly failed to actually bolster his finances during any of these escapades, and with the result that by the start of August or so, 1982, he was rapidly running out of even spending money to survive in Dublin City, and he ended up going to a friend to get a place to stay, to call upon a friend in the hope that he could find himself a place to stay. And I should probably have mentioned that despite the fact that he was involved in these two murders of Nurse Gargan and Mr. Dunn, the Gardaí didn't know who he was. He still wasn't identified as an individual. They had a description of a man that they were looking for, but they didn't have his name. And because he was totally unconnected to the people he murdered, it took a while for the Gardaí to figure out who had done this. So he was in the Dublin City in early August, as I say, or late July, early August, and he called upon an old friend who he hoped might be able to put him up for a few nights. And this old friend agreed to put him up for a few nights. And I should mention that his friend had no idea that Mr. MacArthur was involved in any of the crimes I mentioned. The difficulty, however, was that his old friend was a guy called Patrick Connolly, who was then the Attorney General, the Chief Officer of the Irish State to the GUBU government, to Charles Haughey's government. He was the Attorney General of the Irish State. Now, I should stress that Patrick Connolly had no idea whatsoever that his old friend Malcolm MacArthur was in any way involved in criminality, or certainly in these two murders. He had no idea. When he allowed Mr. MacArthur to stay in his home, he had no idea that Mr. MacArthur had just carried out two murders. Nevertheless, MacArthur stayed with Patrick Connolly for a couple of days, and eventually by, I think it was the 9th of August or so, the Gardaí had honed in on MacArthur through a variety of circumstances that occurred, and identified the fact that this man, the murderer, or suspected murderer, was living in the Attorney General's house. So they called on the Attorney General and they asked him could they enter the house and interview his guest. The Attorney General said, of course, no problem. So the Gardaí came in, and it transpired that they arrested Malcolm MacArthur and took him away. Now, if this wasn't something that could be troublesome enough for the government and embarrassing enough that a murderer had been found in the Attorney General's house, the reaction of Mr. Connolly further exacerbated the problem. He probably was in such shock. I can only imagine he was in shock to have learned from the Gardaí that his old friend was a suspected murderer, double murderer. But rather than staying and giving a statement to Gardaí, Mr. Connolly informed the Gardaí that he had already planned a holiday, which he had, to New York, and he was going to go on his holiday. And he would give a statement to the Gardaí on the events of the last few days when he got back. So Mr. Connolly left the next day, flew to London, and then flew from London to New York. Now, while he was in London, Charles Haughey, the Taoiseach, had contacted him, I believe, and tried to convince him to come back. But Mr. Connolly kind of insisted, I've paid for my holiday, it's all organised, I'm going to America. So Haughey relented. But in the period of time, because it took a few hours, as it still does, to travel from London to the United States, during the period of time in which Mr. Connolly was flying from London to New York, the world media became aware of the fact that a double murderer had been found in the highest, the highest legal officer's home in the land in Ireland. And there was even suspicion that maybe the Attorney General was somehow involved and he was fleeing the jurisdiction to try and get away. This was some of the, the speculation that there was in the media, and particularly the international media, with the result that when Mr. Connolly landed in New York, he was met by a barrage of newspaper reporters, CNN, probably Fox News, whoever else, whoever was around at the time. And he was totally shocked by what had happened. And of course, the media furore had also further broken out here by the time the Irish media understood, or it came to their attention, that this suspected murderer had been found in the Attorney General's house. So obviously Haughey now contact was made between Haughey and Patrick Connolly in New York, and he returned home virtually immediately. And as you can expect, after meeting Haughey for an hour or so, he tendered his resignation. And it was, and again, but I should stress, he had nothing to do with any of the criminality. It was a very unfortunate series of events for Mr. Connolly. But it is as a consequence of this specific event that we have the most famous, one of the most famous political acronyms that we now, at least we had for many years in Irish politics, because subsequent to the Attorney General's resignation, during a press conference, Mr. Haughey described in various terms his views on the events which had occurred in relation to Mr. Connolly. And he uttered phrases such as, it was a grotesque situation, it was an unprecedented situation, it was a bizarre happening, it was an almost unbelievable happenstance. And it is from this, the first letters of grotesque, unprecedented, bizarre and unbelievable, that another long-time adversary of Mr. Haughey, Conor Cruz O'Brien, coined the phrase GUBU, in order and which a phrase which then became appended to this particular government, and has since then become something of a byword for political incompetence or rogue dealings in politics, or simply, I suppose, foolishness oftentimes within Irish politics, and it became part of the political lexicon for some time. However, Mr. Haughey's and therefore Mr. Haughey's travails and difficulties were to be further exacerbated then in early October as a consequence of Charlie McCreevy, a Fianna Fáil TD who originally had been quite supportive of Mr. Haughey back in 1979. He was one of those who supported Haughey because he believed Haughey was going to do what was needed or necessary in terms of fiscal retrenchment to get the Irish economy back into buoyancy, and had been very disillusioned when Mr. Haughey failed to do so. And so Charlie McCreevy decided he was going to launch a challenge against Mr. Haughey's leadership within the Fianna Fáil party. However, it's fair to say that Charlie McCreevy, and of course you see the various events and issues that have been going on with Seán Doherty, with the voting scandal, you know, all these and the issue with MacArthur, all these various issues together, of course, with the continuing difficulties in the Irish economy, all contributed to Charlie McCreevy's sense of exasperation, with the result that, in a very spontaneous way, he tabled a motion of no confidence in early October within the Fianna Fáil party in relation to Mr. Haughey's leadership. But again, it was very spontaneous. There was no organised coup. There was no organised heave. It was just Charlie McCreevy having a solo run to try and oust Charlie Haughey. But once the motion of no confidence was tabled, he did try to get some of the old, or the more familiar opponents of Mr. Haughey to come on board with him and to try and have a more organised leadership coup. With the result that because Charlie McCreevy said he was tired of what he called convulsion politics with this government. And when he was speaking with a number of the potential dissidents, people like Desmond O'Malley and George Colley and others, he effectively told them it was time to defecate or get off the pot. Now, as you can see from the text there, the word he used for defecation was somewhat more demotic and very colloquial, but nevertheless, I think they understood what he meant. That being said, the challenge failed. There was only 22 members of the parliamentary party who ultimately agreed to vote publicly, to voice their clear opposition to Mr. Haughey, with the result that Haughey survived this second major leadership challenge to him in early October, the 6th of October, 1982. And there was a significant degree of it was alleged, it's not an allegation, that there was a significant degree there was a significant climate of intimidation at around this time, with the result that after the parliamentary party meeting was over and Haughey had won the vote, there was a substantial number of his ordinary party members, like from the countryside or from Dublin area, wherever, outside Leinster House waiting for the news for what was going to happen. And as Charlie McCreevy left Leinster House to get into his car to go home, having lost the vote against Mr. Haughey, essentially, he was accosted, both physically and verbally, by supporters of Charles Haughey, and he was referred to as a blue shirt, and also on a few occasions as a bastard, etc., for having had the temerity to challenge the leader. But more importantly, another opponent of Charles Haughey, a man called Jim Gibbons, who those of you who were with us before for our previous lecture might recall, he was the defence minister at the time of the arms crisis in 1970. And he was an outspoken opponent. Well, he was certainly a well-known opponent of Charles Haughey during this period. He was physically attacked and assaulted by members of what we assume were anyway Charles Haughey's support group outside of Leinster House. And furthermore, that journalist we mentioned earlier, Geraldine Kennedy, she was also subject to intimidation at around this time because she was publishing articles about the potential heave against Mr. Haughey, etc. And she received phone calls to her house that were intimidatory, as well as that on one occasion when she returned to her car, there was a broken bottle on the windscreen with a note attached to the wipers, I assume, saying, "We are watching you." So again, obviously I'm not suggesting that Mr. Haughey was in any way orchestrating this or that he knew anything about it, but it seems clear that people who supported him were involved in this kind of activity. Now, this isn't the end of it yet, of the difficulties that this government endured, or the intrigue that this government was engaged in. There were more secret recordings. On this occasion, in the period after that failed attempt at a heave against Haughey, there were a number of people within the anti-Haughey section of the party who were still trying to find a way to oust Mr. Haughey from his position of leadership. And there were some attempts made to try and convince the Labour Party, the Irish Labour Party, who had 15 seats, to vote with Fianna Fáil in Parliament, on the understanding that Labour would only vote with Fianna Fáil once Charlie Haughey was replaced as leader. So there were some efforts to try and orchestrate some kind of an agreement of this nature by the anti-Haughey wing. But there were also rumours swirling around at this time, among some of the anti-Haughey people certainly, that some of those who had supported Haughey at the recent October challenge by McCreevy, and possibly also at the February challenge by Desmond O'Malley, that some of those who supported Haughey may have done so because they were financially beholden to Charles Haughey, that perhaps he had some kind of he might have had some kind of undue influence with them because their own personal finances were in difficulty. And one of the people who learned that he was the subject of such a rumour was a guy called Ray McSharry. He was then a Fianna Fáil TD, and he was the Minister for Finance at that time, yes, in the government. And he had supported Charles Haughey on each of the occasions there was a vote on his leadership. But now McSharry learned, or he believed he had learned, that certain anti-Haughey people were talking about him and making claims to the effect that he, Ray McSharry, was somehow financially beholden to Charles Haughey. And this infuriated Ray McSharry, infuriated him. So he set out to try and discover who was making these statements about him, and he wanted to prove that there was no way he would ever take bribes from anyone. Because he had also heard from another rumour, or maybe the same rumour, that some of the anti-Haughey people who suspected that those who supported Haughey, or some of them may be financially beholden to Mr. Haughey, the anti-Haughey section were prepared, it seemed, to provide finance to some of those TDs who were financially beholden to Haughey to get them to switch their votes in order so that he could no longer have a hold over them. This was another rumour that was going around. So Ray McSharry wanted to prove that he couldn't be bribed. So again, speaking with Seán Doherty, our hapless Minister for Justice, and with Joe Ainsworth, that Assistant Garda Commissioner, Ray McSharry acquired a Garda tape recorder, a police tape recorder, and he tape recorded a conversation between himself and one of the supposed anti-Haughey conspirators, a guy called Martin O'Donoghue. But as it emerged subsequently, there was nothing said in that conversation that indicated that Martin O'Donoghue was going to try and bribe or financially aid, whichever term you want to use, Ray McSharry for his vote. There was a discussion about Haughey's leadership, yes, and it was clear that O'Donoghue wanted Haughey gone. That's absolutely evident in the transcript from the tape, but there's no evidence that there was any attempt to bribe Ray McSharry. And again, it's important to note this particular issue did not emerge into the public domain until the same time as the phone tapping scandal emerged in January, February 1983, after this government had already fallen. But again, what it demonstrates to us is the degree of paranoia, disunity, disorganisation and internal fighting that there was within this government, the GUBU government, between March 1982 and December 1982. So finally, the curtain falls in late October in 1982. As we mentioned earlier, the Fianna Fáil parties and Charlie Haughey's position in the Dáil was already precarious from the very beginning. He had 81 seats, plus some of those independents who voted for him, 2 independents, and of course the occasional support at least of the Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party. But on the 18th of October, a Fianna Fáil TD and strong Haughey supporter, a guy called Bill Lucknan, he died. So this had passed away. So this now meant that Fianna Fáil and Haughey had one less seat in Parliament. And then a few days after Mr. Lucknan passed away, Jim Gibbons, that man I mentioned, the Fianna Fáil TD, Haughey adversary, and the man who had been subjected to an assault by Haughey supporters in Leinster House on the 6th of October, he suffered a heart attack. So now he couldn't vote for Fianna Fáil in Parliament. So Charlie Haughey and the Fianna Fáil party were down 2 votes in Parliament. And then when the Dáil finally, or the Parliament finally resumed after its holiday in late October, the Workers' Party, or Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, indicated to Haughey that they were no longer going to support his, they could no longer guarantee support for the government because in the intervening period between roughly the summer, certainly, and October 1982, Ray McSharry and others had finally convinced Haughey that there had to be serious public spending cuts in order to rebalance the books and to get the Irish economy back on to buoyancy. And of course, being a socialist or left-wing party, the Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, were not particularly favourable towards spending cuts. Equally, Tony Gregory, the man who had supported Haughey on the basis of the Gregory deal, he indicated that while he would be prepared to vote with the government in certain areas, he would not support the government now, given all that had transpired, certainly, if there was a no-confidence motion within Parliament in respect of the government. And so this meant that now Haughey had lost his 3 Workers' Party TDs and potentially Tony Gregory as well, with the result that a no-confidence motion was put forward by, I think, Garret Fitzgerald, the leader of Fine Gael, on the 4th of November. And of course, without the guaranteed votes of Gregory and Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, the combined opposition defeated the government, and therefore the government fell. So this was the final end to what was a very misbegotten and very unfortunate in many ways, but also, I think it's fair to say, on occasion, quite politically incompetent GUBU government of Charles Haughey in 1982. So, what were the consequences, or what is the legacy, in a way, of the GUBU government of 1982? Well, one of the consequences is that it resulted in that Anglo-Irish relations were damaged to a certain extent. There was, I didn't go into it in any detail because it wasn't really a scandal or an intrigue, but it was during this period that Charles Haughey really reverted to a form of irredentist nationalism and kind of an almost Anglophobic tone in relation to Anglo-Irish relations. And it was at this time that the Irish government indicated that it was not going to support EEC sanctions, which had been issued against Argentina in 1982 as a consequence of the Argentines' invasion of the Falkland Islands, which were at that point under British sovereignty. And so when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, Margaret Thatcher and the British government reacted and sent a task force to the South Atlantic, and there was a war, an undeclared war between the Argentine and the UK. And Haughey, taking a somewhat nationalist approach to this, decided that he was not going to support the EEC sanctions against Argentina. And this really, economic sanctions, and this really disgruntled Margaret Thatcher, and it created difficulties for Anglo-Irish relations for quite some time. And it took the incoming Fine Gael Labour government, which won that election in June 1982, in December 1982 to repair relations between Britain and Ireland. The revelations in early 1983, when the incoming Fine Gael Labour government decided to publish much of the details or make public much of the details of the phone tapping scandal and the issues relating to MacSharry and O'Donoghue, this became known as the Irish Watergate for a while, and it caused severe consternation within political circles, but particularly within media circles, that members of the media could be phone tapped and have their privacy abused in such in what was clearly a politically partisan way by a government. It was a very clear abuse of power, and it resulted in the resignations, understandably enough, I suppose, of the commissioner of the Gardaí at the time, Patrick McLaughlin, and what had been the assistant commissioner, but at this point had actually been promoted to the position of the deputy commissioner, Joe Ainsworth. Those two Gardaí who were so involved in the phone tapping scandal, they both resigned. And in the case of Joe Ainsworth in particular, I suppose it's rather unfortunate for him, because he certainly would have been in line for potentially being the commissioner of the Gardaí himself at a later date if his career had not been so abruptly ended. There was also another leadership challenge to Mr. Haughey in February 1983, just as the whole scandal was emerging in the public domain in relation to the phone tapping. And however, I won't go too much into the detail, but he managed to survive this one as well, but also again within a significant climate of intimidation. And indeed, one of the opponents of Mr. Haughey in the party, who was advocating that there should be a new leader, a guy called Ben Briscoe, who was a Fianna Fáil TD and happened to be Jewish, he received phone calls to his house that were during the period before the vote on Mr. Haughey's leadership, in which he was subject to a lot of abuse, including apparently he was told Hitler should have finished the job. So I think this gives us an indication again of the nature of some of those who seem to have been staunch supporters of Mr. Haughey at this time. Another consequence of the GUBU government was the public perceptions that it had of the police, the Irish police, and of the potential for political interference in the police. That being said, I think it's fair to say that it didn't undermine public confidence at that time in totality in the ordinary Garda or the ordinary policeman, but there was a continuing and lingering suspicion thereafter that there may be, at certain intervals, there may be political interference in the police. And it also had an effect on relations between the Irish police and the Northern Irish police, because after the commissioner resigned and Joe Ainsworth resigned, there was a new commissioner, a guy called Larry Wren, or Lawrence Wren, and this man was known to be of the utmost integrity, and he, it would appear, was certainly suspicious that there had been some form of collusion between higher elements within the Royal Ulster Constabulary and elements within the Gardaí that was above his pay grade back in 1982. He suspected there had been something was wrong in relation to this affair in which James McGovern had been detained by the RUC and prevented from coming to court back in September 1982, with the result that for at least a year, if not more, the new commissioner of the Gardaí, Larry Wren, refused to even speak to his opposite number in Northern Ireland, the chief constable. His name escapes me now for a moment, I'm sorry, it'll come back to me. Herman, a guy called Herman. And so it damaged RUC Garda relations for a while. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, the term GUBU entered the political lexicon. It remained a very popular term for many years as a byword for political foolishness and mistakes and incompetence, I suppose. Although I think I've noted in recent years, I don't hear it used as much. I don't read it being used as much in the media, which is perhaps somewhat unfortunate, because it was certainly useful in terms of giving someone an impression of your view of the failures or foolishness of a government. Another consequence of the GUBU period in power was the effect it had on the career of Tony Gregory, that left-wing TD that I mentioned, who was first elected in February 1982. He, because of the Gregory deal, he became a hero in his local community. And now he also worked very assiduously in the years afterwards. He was known to be a very conscientious and able community worker. And so But at least partially as a consequence of this phenomenal deal, this 80, or he didn't get all the £80 million in the end because the government obviously fell reasonably quickly, but the fact that he had been able to extract this deal and had gotten substantial investment during the months in which the GUBU government was in power. He, as I say, he was a hero in his local community, and it contributed to his continued success as an independent TD. And subsequent to this, he never lost an election again. His first election was in as I say, February 1982 anyway, but at every subsequent election he was returned to the Irish Parliament. And even though he passed away tragically due to cancer in 2009, his legacy, and therefore the Gregory Deal legacy, still lives on, because the TD that was the person who won his seat when he passed away in 2009, she advertised herself as the Gregory Group candidate. She had been a close friend and supporter of Tony Gregory and part of his election team. And she was elected to his seat in 2009, and she still sits in the Irish Parliament today. So in a way, there's at least, depending on one's perspective, there's at least one somewhat positive legacy, at least from the perspective of Tony Gregory's support base. And then lastly, I suppose the most major consequence in a way were the consequences for Seán Doherty, the hapless Minister for Justice at the centre of many of these intrigues, and of course ultimately for Charles Haughey. In the immediate aftermath of the breaking of the scandals by the Fine Gael Labour coalition, as I mentioned, they brought much of these issues out into the public in relation to the phone tapping in January, February 1983. There had been a heave, as I mentioned then, as a consequence within the Fianna Fáil party to try and oust Charles Haughey as leader, because he had now failed again to win an election, and of course all this scandal had occurred. But Seán Doherty, as they say, fell on his sword. Seán Doherty claimed basically at the Fianna Fáil parliamentary party meeting, and I suppose at any point thereafter that he was subsequently asked about it, he claimed that the sole responsibility for tapping the phones of the journalists, this inappropriate and arguably illegal tapping of these journalists' phones, the sole responsibility lay with him and not with his leader, Charles Haughey. He fell on his sword essentially and protected Charles Haughey, so that Haughey was able to therefore convince sufficient people at the parliamentary party meeting, and indeed in the world at large, I suppose, that he knew nothing about the attempts to illegally and inappropriately tap the phones of Geraldine Kennedy and Bruce Arnold. And I suppose it's possible, I mean we can't be sure, but it's possible that, and as a consequence of this, Seán Doherty had to leave the Fianna Fáil party for a while. He lost the whip, as they say. He had to leave Fianna Fáil. Now he was later allowed back in, I think it was in 1984. But after that he was never able to really gain any kind of position of influence within the Fianna Fáil party. And I suppose when he originally fell on his sword in February 1983 and claimed that he was the only one responsible, politically anyway, for the phone tappings, it's possible he thought that Haughey was going to reward him later. That at some point in the future, the boss, Haughey, when perhaps he was Taoiseach again later on, that he would do right by Seán Doherty and find a way to bring Seán Doherty back into the elite of Fianna Fáil. But this didn't happen, not really, and it's possible, only saying it's possible, that Seán Doherty may have begun to grow a grudge or to bear a grudge against Mr. Haughey thereafter. With the result that in 1992, when Haughey, who was again Taoiseach in 1992, was beginning to have some other internal difficulties within Fianna Fáil, there was a potential heave in the offing on the part of a guy called Albert Reynolds in 1992. But before that heave really took place, or the second one of 1992 anyway, Seán Doherty let it be known publicly. He was involved in an interview on RTE television on a programme called Nighthawks at the time, in which he indicated that other people in political power did know about the phone taps at the time he instituted them, that it wasn't just him that knew about it or that agreed with it. Subsequent to this then, probably a week or so or less after this, he then made a very clear public statement at a press conference in which he directly implied or directly stated that Charles Haughey knew about the phone taps because he, Seán Doherty, had brought the transcripts to Charles Haughey in 1982 and handed them to him. The transcripts of the conversations that Bruce Arnold and Geraldine Kennedy, the journalist, would have been having with possible members of Fianna Fáil back in 1982. So this made Charles Haughey's position in 1992 untenable. He now had a former Minister for Justice who had originally fallen on his sword, but was now claiming a road to Damascus conversion, if you will, and saying that Haughey knew all about it. Haughey lied. Now, Haughey tried to brazen it out initially in 1992, but at this point he was in a coalition government, and he was, and actually his old adversary, Desmond O'Malley, was the leader of the other party in coalition. O'Malley had since left Fianna Fáil and formed his own party called the Progressive Democrats. O'Malley effectively went to Haughey and said, "You've got to go. There's no, you can't weather this. Either you go or we're pulling out of government," essentially. So with the result that Haughey finally resigned in 1992. But the proximate reason why he had to resign in 1992 was because of this lingering legacy of the events of the GUBU government, and the fact that he had known about the phone tapping of those journalists back in 1982. So just before I let you go, and I assure you we're quite close to the end now, just one or two brief thoughts on the overall, I suppose, the legacy of the GUBU government. In his overview of Irish society in the 1970s and 1980s, the journalist Eamon Sweeney has described the tenure of the GUBU government as one in which there was a general feeling that political life was being scripted by a satirist of genius. And when one considers the events of this period, from accusations of voting fraud to an improbable political stroke in pursuit of an extra Dáil seat, onto the incredible discovery of a double murderer in the home of the chief law officer of the state, some could almost be forgiven for taking Sweeney's description rather literally. That is to say, there almost appears to have been an omnipotent, divine, yet emotionally dark comedian whose greatest endeavour was the creation of the most dysfunctional government in Ireland's history. To many others, however, the sometimes grotesque, often unbelievable, rather bizarre, and occasionally unprecedented travails of this administration arguably symbolises the extent to which life, be it political life or otherwise, may well be beyond anyone's ultimate control. For what entity, human or divine, could possibly have conceived, constructed or designed the GUBU story? The GUBU story stands out, and the GUBU story stands alone. Moreover, considering the devastation that was left in its wake, pillars of the state undermined, careers abruptly ended, reputations ruined, politics debased, and tragically lives lost, we must hope that the GUBU story shall always stand alone. Thank you for your time and for listening.